Yay Networks.
Welcome to Greg Louganis is Alive, the podcast that challenges what you think you know. I'm your host, Greg Louganis, and yes, I'm alive. I'm joined by my good friend, Beth Zinman.
Greg, thank you. I'm so excited to do this with you. You know, we don't get to do this as often as I'd like, and I love unpacking interesting topics with you.
Yeah, and this is a really interesting topic. It's transgender in sport. I mean, there's so much information to absorb, so much misinformation to discard. You know, traversing this topic is just incredible.
You know, I know this is something you feel really strongly about. This is also why we wanted to, lead with this episode. I remember when we were talking and we realized, like, kind of making that link of in the 88 Olympics, training and then competing while taking AZT for your HIV. and that we realized, that everything you were struggling with and the suffering really very much would look like what a transitioned or transitioning athlete could be going through, which was just mind-blowing to me, the severity of that. And also that they don't even use AZT anymore because it was so toxic. Like, that's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, I was diagnosed HIV positive 8 months prior to the Olympic, or 6 months prior to the Olympic Games. And they wanted to treat me really aggressively. And you also have to understand too, for the lay person, an elite athlete trains on cycles. They can't maintain peak fitness, peak conditioning over a sustained period of time. You're early on in the training, you're breaking everything down to create a solid foundation. And so you're breaking everything down, doing high repetitions and, plyometrics and weightlifting and all that stuff to tear things down. Well, what was happening to me early on in my training in preparation for 88 that year was I was put on AZT. I didn't know that a depletion of testosterone was a potential side effect of the AZT. So I didn't have that information. I just thought I was overtraining. And I mean, I would wake up in the morning, I would literally crawl to my bathroom and I'd pour myself the hottest bath I could stand. And I'd slink into the bath and it'd be about 20 minutes before I could, touch my toes, just to get going, to get moving. And I thought I was overtraining. I was terrified to share this with anybody, not even my coach, Ron O'Brien, because I was afraid. I knew that the Chinese had caught up to me and that I was hanging on by the skin of my teeth and I had to be in the absolute best shape that I could potentially be in. And so I went through that experience. Looking back on it, I realized more than likely I was low testosterone. That was it. I was low on that hormone to be able to recover. And that I was pushing my body to its limits, and it just wasn't recovering. So when I read in Kristen's book, Woman Enough, about her experience with going on hormone suppression therapy, what she described, I'm like, oh my God, that was me in 88. So I recognized that. And that was just so telling because I know, look, I'm friends many of my friends are world record holders, and all that stuff. We've crossed paths and all that, and, protecting their world record. I don't have that same attitude. My attitude is, I want to see my records broken. I want to see it. I want to experience it. I know what it felt like, but I want to see it in somebody else. But not everybody's like that because they are who their records showed, that they identify so closely with that. But, and I understand all of that and advantages, unfair advantages. I'm all for fairness. But what is fair? I'm trying to navigate what that looks like, because we are taught to believe, we're given certain information. If we learn that somebody lied to us or the information was faulty, then we have to change our beliefs. So, and it really goes to where I am these days, is questioning my beliefs. Are they real? Where are they from? What's the truth? And the truth can be a moving target. So, it just like, be open. And I think the important thing to me is that we side on the side of kindness. I think that is really the key.
That's beautiful. You would think that, right?
Yeah.
That would be amazing if we could do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what gets me about that is, you said it, you're taking a drug that's affecting your testosterone. We did find that out. That's a real effect of AZT. And athletes that are transitioning, from being biologically male to female, yes, they're suppressing testosterone on purpose. So the advantage is no longer there. They're at a disadvantage. I mean, you would think, knowing this information, but let's find out, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm super excited to hear this interview that you have with Kristen. I don't think there's any quote unquote lay person who knows more than she does.
Right.
And it should be really, really enlightening. So, so you guys take it away. So tell me about Kristen.
Okay. Kristen is a world-class cyclist. And now international inclusivity and diversity advisor, educator, public speaker, author, wrote an incredible book, Woman Enough. And she's the first athlete to legally challenge the gender policies of the International Olympic Committee. So we'll be back with Kristen right after this break. So Kristen, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited about the chance and opportunity to unpack some of this stuff. Really, we need to like break it down for the lay person. Okay, so each Olympic team is chosen differently. Like in diving, we had like a one-time trial. You had to qualify for that trial at the senior nationals, and then that got you the invitation to the Olympic trials, and then it's a one-time trial, and the top two competitors go to the Olympic Games. That's our Olympic team. Now, in cycling in Canada, what's the process that you go through in making the cycling Olympic team?
In Greg, thanks for having me on. And I just want to, first of all, say what a wonderful intro that you and Beth had shared together at the opening of this conversation. It was wonderful, and it was right on. And I just want to say how much of a pleasure it is to be here and in part of this podcast with you today. Regarding the process of Olympic qualifications in the sport of cycling in Canada, it's pretty universal around in most countries. With the way the UCI breaks it down, which is the Union Cycling International in Switzerland, it's a pretty set standard. It's basically based on events qualifications over a period of time, and how staying in that top 10% percentile consistently, nationally and internationally in your events, and then on your national championships, they both, which is typically in the month of June, leading up to particularly at the end of July Olympic Games schedule. So it's typically within that 1 month arc in terms of team qualifications, but it's usually done precipitously over time based on top 10 finishes nationally and internationally.
So in cycling, it's not like a one-time trial. It's like you're invited to a trial and then that's it. So it's a consistent performance.
Yeah, and I think just also to help, there's different forms of cycling events. So if we look at the road racing and the track events, there's individual events at participation, then there's the team pursuit events. So there are very specific disciplines, particularly with the team pursuit, which is 3 to 4 athletes. Typically in the women's, it's 3 athletes in the women's pursuit. And so what happens is within that process, it is from Olympic Games to Olympic Games, typically the national team of a given country, this being Canada, for example, will have 3 or 4 or 5 athletes that they're trying to focus on over a period of a year to 2 years leading up to a major games. And try to focus on that discipline of that one group of women with a spare athlete.
And there are totally different events, different skill sets, aren't they? I mean, the way that I would probably equate that to, from my experience, is 3-meter springboard is totally different from 10-meter diving. It's all diving, but they're 2 totally separate events.
Right. So you've got, exactly, it's very similar that way. So you've got the shorter, longer events. There's the individual group events. And then there's the individual team, single pursuit or team pursuit events. Right. And they all vary in length. Some of them are, then you've got the sprint events, which are like similar to track and field, which, you go, 500 meters, 1,000-meter events. So, and it breaks out that way. So the longer the meters per event, it will then increase. You go from a sprinting event to an endurance event. That's probably the easiest way to explain it.
Yeah. I mean, and that's like athletics kind of thing.
Very similar to
you have your sprint events. Yeah, you have your sprint events, but then you also have your endurance events like the marathon and that sort of thing.
Exactly.
So yeah. So, I mean, it really is an elite group, that's being looked at and considered, and all of the things that go into that. Now, getting back to the topic, what is gender verification?
Basic gender verification varies on country to country, and I think it also varies sport to sport. It appears historically. Gender verification for me was psychological and physical examination and oversight of my physiology, and with the implications to understanding a series of steps that would allow me to be approved to participate as a prerequisite to my participation in my given sport. So, and that would equate to the sport of cycling, is my experience. In past, like historically, gentrification has varied greatly based on genetic testing, with the buccal smear testing. And way back in the early days of the Olympic movement, engagement of women in sport was what we call the gender parades, where women had to parade naked in front of female physicians to assure that they had the sex characteristics of a female anatomy.
So, what policies did the IOC have in the past that were harmful to athletes? Right, and I'd like you to share your own personal experience of what that was, what it was like.
Sure. If I can explain, if I could say right off the bat, every policy at the IOC in terms of gentrification has harmed athletes right off the bat. I mean, I think that is a given, and it's also based on your kind of Eurocentric thinking of of male and female participation in society, then reflected into the elite sporting system, to which you and I are familiar with. And so, for me, I was the first athlete in the world back in 2005, 2006 to be gender tested under the new policy as it related to transitioned athletes in sport generally, and specifically to the Olympic movement. As a prerequisite, the IOC had set, under the auspice and umbrella of the Olympic movement, a standard to which countries would follow through, and international federations would collaborate and follow through on through these prerequisite of standards set by the IOC that were then put upon a given athlete in a given country, which is was my experience, and put through these series of events through a form of gender verification.
Verification.
Yes.
Now, Kristen, okay, where did that standard come from? Where did the IOC get this quote unquote standard for gender verification?
Yeah, that's a great question, Greg. The IOC actually hosted a one-day medical event in Lausanne back in 2003, just before the leading up to the hosting of the Olympics in 2004 in Athens. They actually released it just before the Athens Olympics as a standard. They actually hosted a one day, as I said, a one-day event with 3 or 4 or 5 medical practitioners in this space, and actually a gentleman who I've known for many years by the name of Dr. Louis Gurin, who is an expert in gender, one of the top in the world actually, out of the Netherlands, and they sat around a table and they set a standard. There was no science and research done. All it was a sitting down of assumed experts the IOC had put together, and wrote this document as a standard. There was no set research. There was no set standard specifically to which they developed this policy. So it was left. So It was left to the international federations to compose their own idea of gender verification based on that document, which the IOC had published through the Olympic movement to all the signatory nations and international federations affiliated to the Olympic movement. Yeah, a lot of moving parts.
Yeah. Now, okay, so I mean, Kristen, in my conversations with you, I had to learn a lot. I mean, it was a huge learning curve for me. One of the things that we've discussed is an endocrinologist. What is an endocrinologist, and how is that related, and how does that relate to you?
Well, an endocrinologist is somebody who, just for the simplest way of depicting it to our listeners, is somebody who deals with the well-being of each human being based on their, as it sounds, endocrine system, and the use of how hormones function in the human physiology. So they are experts, supposed experts in that specific space, in ensuring and moderate and being able to adjust within the endocrine system to make sure that you and I are healthy every single day of our lives as we age. And there's functions that the body carries on multiple, thousands of functions every single day that are aligned to our endocrine system that you and I never think about. And so those are the things that endocrinology focuses on in the science of endocrinology.
From the sounds of it, was there an endocrinologist on the panel of what the IOC, International Olympic Committee, was kind of putting down as their, conditions for competing? They
did that very specifically as part of the masthead of the document to ensure, for the purpose of legal liability, they put in place that person, not necessarily that person who is an expert specific to this particular area, of somebody who's gone through transition, certainly somebody who has an endocrinology background. And that's been some of the challenges and the problems to which has created a lot of systematic problems over the first 2 decades, is that they've never really had the right people at the table. And as we know, they've never done the science and the research to the policies in the first place. So it's been an arduous 2 decades of problems that have led to, unfortunately, harmful situations for athletes.
What are some of the harms? I mean, how would that be experienced?
Well,
I mean,
back in the day, so back in when I was competing and when I had to go through all the gender testing, and so first of all, there was no process of gender testing. So the 8 people that were engaged in my gender testing, I took on their belief that they knew what they were doing. And for me as sport, I came back into, I was competing in sport years before that. I had not decided after my transition to come back to sport, because at that time I had broken my pelvis. I shattered my pelvis, and it took me a year to learn how to walk again. And it was never on my radar to come back to sport. I only came back to sport from the elite system solely because of connecting to community, and something that sport has always done. It's always been kind of that connector, something that's familiar, I think, to you and I, Greg, having grown up in it since the age of 9 personally. It was important for me to create that connection. I enjoy that connection to my community, and by the activity of cycling enabled me to have that relationship. It was never about coming back into the elite system. So out of that time period, I had to go through that process, and I would be the first athlete in the world to do that, and to learn that there was no science and research to the policies, and the individuals that were taking on this policy and enacting upon it. And it also included the physicians from International Cycling, as well as the World Anti-Doping Agency, as well as I have to be really careful here because I'm under non-disclosures through my legal process. Actors of the sport of cycling within the Canadian system that did this to me. So they were all enacting in that process, thinking that the policies to which the IOC had created was backed by science and research, to which it was not. So it was harmful from the very beginning because it never needed to happen. But more so is because the individuals that were participating in it didn't know what they were doing and why they were, in the end, didn't know why they were doing it, other than the fact that they felt that I somehow was, back in those days, I was a threat to sporting activity in my given sport.
I know we've had conversations in the past about Laura, from the weightlifter. Remind me her name.
Laurel Hubbard. Yeah, she's a fellow Kiwi.
Laurel, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so a fellow Kiwi who was transgender, and actually in our discussions that we had, was sharing our concern for her health and well-being.
Right, that's right.
Because she did get that injury, when she was in a pre-Olympic competition, and it was, pretty devastating.
Yeah.
And also, she wasn't in competition. She wasn't going to, make the podium. She was not, because when, and that's the reason why the endocrinologists, it's like what they're studying is how hormones, are affected, and we maintain and sustain health and
right.
are in our own body, and I think that's what really kind of, really brought to light when in your book, Woman Enough, when you described what was happening to your body during that time.
Right.
That it was basically eating itself up from the inside out.
Right, Greg, and that's correct. And so what happens, if I can just to there's multiple pieces to it. The things that you just were just talking about, and I think initially, I think that I want to be able to explain is the issue is that Laurel and I, as an example, we are transitioned athletes. There's very different physiologies, and to which there are transgender athletes who have not had the surgical interventions of their physiology. So that is the removal of their sex organs and their primary hormone source, which is the testicles or ovaries. And in the case of a transition female is to be able to create the vulva. Just simple science. And so what happens is there's like the disruption of the endocrine system, which is like a figure 8. So there's this constant circling back to the hypothalamus gland and in the pituitary gland in the brain that circulates thousands of times a day in these actions that you and I are going on every single moment in our 24 hours a day for us, that are carefully doing close to 200 different actions. And so what happens is when you have the sex reassignment surgery to create the vulva through your transition, what happens is there's actually a physical disruption in that part of the physiology. So when you remove the central place where the hormones are being created, so it's like taking the gas out of the engine or the oil out of the engine block, and all of a sudden things start to happen and rub against each other and start to fail. So what happens when you take the primary source of testosterone, which is in the XY or the assumed male physiology that you're born with, what happens when you take that primary hormone out, things start to fail. So what happens is over time, what's called complete androgen deprivation. So the body actually will start to fail because the primary hormone that helps to be able to regulate body function, core body temperature, your metabolic function, all those different elements that are in play are all of a sudden not having that reaction because, first of all, the connection that creates that stimulus is gone. So what happens is, a very simple example. Say you and I go for a bike ride and we go for 50 kilometers or 30 miles, and then we go for this ride. What happens is when we're riding our bike, okay, you and I get that euphoric feeling in our brain because that's our hypothalamus gland and our pituitary gland saying, okay, Greg's needing to increase his testosterone levels to help him recover during his ride and regulate his heart rate, regulate his metabolic function, and helping you to recover during your ride and after your ride. So what happens is the message goes out from your brain. It goes down through your endocrine system, goes down to your gonads, and then increases the testosterone, and then it circulates back. So what happens with somebody who's been through the surgical intervention of their body, like me and Laurel, for instance, as an example, we get that same response in our brain, euphoric function in our brain. But it happens is the message goes out, but there's nothing to connect it to. So what happens?
Nothing to come back.
Right.
Nothing to come back.
There's no stimulus, right? And so there's no hormone. So what happens is for you or we can use other female athletes as an example, their bodies continue to develop as they train. And what happens is for athletes like me and Laurel, our bodies continue to fail us. Because what happens is we don't, even though we get that euphoric feeling in our brains, like anybody else when we do exercise, but we're not getting that hormonal response. So for me, even track cycling is a great example of this. So in my cycling career, I went from road racing to track racing, and then I went from endurance racing to short pursuit racing. Because what was happening as my body atrophied over this period of time, I wasn't getting the recover like all the other athletes. And as you know, in your diving days, it's who in that top percentile can recover the quickest. So as soon
can recover the quickest, right?
Through event to event, right? Every event, right? So in the sport of cycling or in track cycling, for instance, as the night would go on, because they're typically night events, what would happen is that my body would not recover every time I get onto the saddle of the bike into the next event, and my other girlfriends would recover. So that percentage of recovery is really, really important between events and who's going to be finishing in the top 3, let alone in the top 10. And so for me, over time, I could no longer compete in my elite sport because my body lost the ability to sustain it. And that's consistently happens. I have many other athlete friends, even in the sport of golf, where my very close friend, Marianne Bagger, who was originally from Denmark, she's now living in Australia. She did not leave the pro tour in the women's European tour because of age and just maturing out of the sport. Her drive became shorter and shorter and shorter. And so she couldn't compete with the other girls because of the enormity of the hormone deprivation that her body was continuing to fail her. So it's we know this happens within about a 10-year cycle of the surgical intervention of the body.
Okay. So with people, I mean, because a lot of what I've heard, is like world record holder, somebody who holds the world record, they're concerned and terrified that, some transgender is going to break their record. I mean, is that, after all of our conversations, that we've shared, it's like, it's not the advantage that everybody is making it out to be, going through puberty and having this testosterone wash. I mean, even my experience in 1988, if my body wasn't recovering,
right,
because I'm sure I was low testosterone and I'm competing at at an elite level.
Right.
I just, and the thing is, the first thing, and I know that we've discussed this, is do no harm.
Right.
Right. And so has the IOC, International Olympic Committee, changed its policies since then?
It's been a journey.
Or is it evolving? It's a journey.
It's evolved. I think we've come to a 2-decade pivot. And you've the health and well-being is the key part. And I think the IOC's known the science since 2007, 2008. So the IOC came forward in 2008 when I was able to pull together a meeting here in Canada over a conference call with the leadership of the government of Canada in high performance sport, where the IOC admitted into the policy, which I was gender tested. In that moment, the gentleman's name was Dr. Patrick Chumash. He was a Frenchman, as a vice president of the medical commission at the time for the IOC. It was back in September. I'll never forget it. September 28th, 2008, when I was able to pull this together. And it was me and Marianne actually on the call. And we had members of the Canadian government in high performance sitting on the call privately. It was back in the day when we didn't have Zoom abilities like we do today. You had to organize it with your phone carrier and so on. It was pretty challenging to organize all this. But anyway, to make a long story short, what happened was it got to a point where me and Marianne were asking Dr. Chumash, Patrick, who was one of the authors of the original policy, really strong, telling him how our bodies were failing us. And all of a sudden, Patrick blurted out, and he said, and he directed it right at me because he was in a very irritated tone, and said to me, he goes, "Tristan, we didn't do the science and the research to the policy that you were tested." And so it was a moment which Marianne and I knew, but it was really the point to which the IOC needed to tell, and I think it was his feelings and his targeting by targeting me. It wasn't so much even that he saw the issue as being a problem. It was more the fact that he, as an IOC member at that senior level, was admitting to his colleagues and to the government of Canada at that moment in time that the policies to which they violated me never had science and research to it. So that was a profound moment for the government of Canada, because they realized they virtually raped me. And so so then the IOC, through Dr. Chumash at that time, just to bring the story along, how we got to this point where we are today, is they would, over a period from 2008 through to 2014, to collectively with the government of Canada, World Cycling, World Anti-Doping Agency, and the IOC, would download on me to prevent from what happened, from the world, preventing the world from knowing what happened to me, but also with what I knew. So it was only in 2014, just to give you an idea of how we had to push this out, I would have to have the case in Toronto, where I went outside the court of arbitration, the autonomous system of sport that you and I are familiar with, that allowed me to bring them into a result in Toronto, which would push them to change policy, because we knew it was doing harm and trauma. But it was the problem of at the time is the IOC didn't want the public to know what they had done. So this became more of an issue of liability, public awareness, because the issues of sex reassignment, which was originally part of the prerequisite of sport back in 2003, would have been in sport today if I hadn't been successful with the court case in Toronto, to which they would remove sex reassignment from the policy because they knew how harmful it was and impactful it was to the human physiology, just as you and I are talking about now. And back in 2009, I would receive, this is really important, Greg, I would receive the first therapeutic use exemption, which is a TUE is the acronym, for therapeutic use of androgens, because at that time they knew they knew exactly what was going on and how it impacted the health of the well-being of the body, and in your own experience as well.
You talk about the UTI, which is basically kind of an intervention to sustain your health and wellness,
right?
And also in, we also have to understand too, each individual is an individual. So we produce and absorb various hormones differently. Right. What do you say to like somebody who says, well, some transgender born male transition to female, they're going to break all these records and and make any type of claim like that because they went through puberty and had this testosterone. I mean, what is the reality of that, or is that just myth?
It's and I want to be fair to those who will be listening. That is a social myth. It's also, when we talk about this, is the design of sport. And I think it's really important to really understand how sport was designed. It was designed by men for men to entertain men. So back in 1896, when Pierre de Coubertin designed the modern Olympic Games, it was always designed with that Eurocentric ideal of potentially 16 different countries, designed by men for men to entertain men. And I come from the architecture world, as you know, and even the way we design stadia and so on, stadiums and so on around the world have been based on that Eurocentric male model of, and reinforced how we design stadiums and event sites on the male ideal of sport. So sport was never designed for the purpose of women, let alone varying issues of physiology, let alone issues of even if we look at Paralympic sport and the growth and the transition that Paralympic sport has taken from disability to ability-based sport based on the supporting and advancements of technology, right? It's been incredible, that growth, right? So, which is wonderful. So the idea that where people talk about the social breaks of male and female sport is not true. The way that we have historically, the idea of when people talk about we've divided women's and male sport up based on physiology is not historically accurate. It was designed this way because at that time, that when women started to engage back in sport back in the 30s and started to slowly integrate into the system, it was solely a male sporting environment. And so, and women were never perceived to be able to be participants in sport. So it's not designed on the ideologically in the ideals of the science of women's bodies and sport, the way it's been prescribed or it's been socialized or assumed that it's been socialized that way. That's historically untrue. So the issue is anything beyond male-identified sport, based on de Coubertin's model back in the day, is always going to be an accommodation. So the issue is that we have to move to a place of integration in changing sport to be more engaged, very much what we're seeing in the Paralympic movement. And it's a great way to actually think about it in its design ways, is because the modern Paralympic Games came out of the development back after the Second World War, back in 1946, where it was an activity for disabled, I'm going to use for that time period, disabled athletes in Great Britain to participate actively in some kind of sporting activity based on their abilities. And so where it is today is phenomenal, because what's happened is technology and social changes have advanced in such a way that we've now moved from an ideal of the ideas of disability to a place of ability-based activity, and from transitioning from the sporting environment, the elite sporting environment, to everyday life. It's been phenomenal how it's transcended people's lives who are living with that experience, but also how we are changing our thinking and socializing our thinking around what we assume used to be around the ideas of disability.
Yeah, and the Olympian and the Paralympians that I've been in contact with, I mean, that is really at the core is community. Is to have that community, which is, goes to mental health, and health and wellness in general, overall health and wellness. Yeah, I mean, it's more about the participation, community, making those human connections. Now, with all of the talk and chatter that's out there, why do you feel people should care about this?
That's a challenging question to me, for me to answer all at once. It's in pieces. I'm in a place that I have to, I know I'm going to use the word, I have to care about it. That's the best way to explain this. I wake up every morning here in Canada. I see what goes on in the United States every single day, and in Europe. And I know I am on that carousel. With the International Olympic Committee, I'm part of this historical record to which me and the IOC have had this interaction for close to 2 decades, to which these things have happened in sport. This is directly aligned to my association to the IOC, in our historical record, and me trying to defend and protect young people, as I've done in every case with the IOC, in my interactions with them, is to ensure the harm starts and stops at me. And coming out of what happened in Toronto, and then the removal of sex reassignment out of the policy, inevitably out of that they removed on their own, by the way, to reduce the liability that was attached to it for their historical record, because he had to answer in a civil court, and also in human rights tribunal here in Canada, independent of the Court of Arbitration. So they couldn't politicize it. They didn't know the other actors, and they had to come with science, which they couldn't do. And so they created this policy back in before Lady got to that, by removing sex reassignment and publishing to the world, making it like they were wanting to be more inclusive in sport. And it was the farthest thing from the truth. And what it was their reaction to what they were doing here in Toronto, because of the nature of the liability, that had that was concurrent in our relationship, and that they had to respond to that here in Toronto. So for 5 years, the policy would remain in place that came out of the court case regarding sex reassignment being removed from the policy, which I think is important from the standpoint of health and well-being. But what the problem was with that, Greg, is that there was no science and research to back that policy. That policy was based on a meeting that they had in the middle of November back in 2015, a one-day meeting again, as the IOC does so often, as a way to create a policy to reflect a change in their behavior for their to limit the liability that they, in what they were having to present themselves here in Toronto, which they failed to do. And so it's really important is that the focus became, for me, has always been health and well-being, because we know the importance of testosterone in the physiology, and we know the consequence of that. And the IOC has known that since almost from the very beginning.
So, Kristen, does a transition female really have an advantage over athletes born female? Is there an advantage?
I don't even like that question.
I'm sorry.
No, it's not your fault. This is such a socially it's such a socially incorrect question. It's not you yourself, Greg, but it was all we know. It's such a socially designed question that is inaccurate to what the physiologies of the bodies that we're talking about, because a lot of the people are answering those who are in this space, or they present themselves in this space, are always talking about the male physiology and the female physiology. And as you elegantly said earlier, is that each person is independent, and how the body uses hormones. That is absolutely correct. The issue is what you've got people who are engaged in this space, who are looking at the physiology of a specific physiology and taking this umbrella and saying that they are all the same. And as you and I know, being around our Olympic friends, and I sometimes I'm around some of my girlfriends who are Olympic swimmers, and my nose is right in their breast line when I see them. Like, I'm 5'7", and in my competitive days I was 120 pounds. So I got down as low as 116 pounds. So I was tiny. So the idea that there are these physiologies and these body types, they're all of varying degrees. They're all varying in the sense how their bodies function and their metabolic functions, and how they utilize hormones. And so, as Thomas Bach has learned, I can use Thomas as an example, the president of the CEO of the IOC. He's learned that through the process of my re-engagement with the IOC and the rewriting of the guidelines, which is based on our historical record of trauma, maltreatment, and in the 2 decades of never doing the science and the research, the policies, is that it could never have been done on an umbrella basis. And how we look at the health and well-being, which is the primary focus of the IOC's guidelines today, which I wrote, is based on ensuring, like the day I walked into Olympic House 3 years ago, November 1st, 2019, one of the very first things I said to them, I said, I'm here to ensure the harm starts and stops at me. I said that to the leadership of the IOC. That was one of the very first things I said and stipulated with them when I arrived on site privately with them. And that is key to the changes of the guidelines of the policies of the IOC, is that it is about do no harm. It is about the health and well-being and long-term participation. And what we do know, and as the IOC knows very well, is when you take the hormones out of the human physiology, we know now there's about a 10-year period of time where the body will fail, and no longer the athlete will be able to participate in sport because the body doesn't have its ability to sustain itself. So under the Olympic movement, under the Olympic Charter, that's not a system to which we believe in. Is what we believe in is what sport is about. And so the IOC has learned its lessons, and knowing the historical record that we've engaged in over the last 2 decades, is that we were harming individuals. We have harmed athletes, we've harmed individuals, and that the science has always been clear. So when people say there's no sciences, there's not a lot of history, blah, 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 that is completely untrue. And I can give you a really great example. If we can come back to Laurel Hubbard. Back in 2018, I did not know Laurel personally at that point, but it was April 2018, and unfamiliar to the a lot of American listeners is what we call the Commonwealth Games. And she was participating in Brisbane at the Gold Coast at the Commonwealth Games in the women's weightlifting. And 2 weeks leading up to the Brisbane Games, my physicians, who are some of the very top in the world in this space in the world, we were watching Laurel in media and so on, and in other pre-events that she was doing. And I was looking, we could see that she was about 7-8 years into her transition from her surgical intervention of her physiology, and that we could tell the increased body weight, certain metabolic things that we were seeing that most people would never have seen. We sent 2 letters to the leadership of the Commonwealth Games Federation, saying that we were concerned about her well-being on the field of play. And the one consideration which a lot of people don't think about is that the role of testosterone in the XY physiology, so in the male-born physiology, just to make it easy for this conversation, is the stimulus, the hormone stimulus that comes from the primary hormone testosterone. And so what happens is, in terms of her joint health, is the ligament health is stimulated by testosterone in the regeneration of cells. So what happens when the hormone is taken away over a period of time, what's happening, unaware to the athlete, unaware to her coaches, unaware to her federation, because the IOC never did the research in the first place. They only assumed they did when she signed on to that policy back in 2011 with World Weightlifting, that the IOC had done that and had procured to ensure her safety on the field of play. That never happened. So what happened was, by 2018, so that 7-8 year window that she was in, where the body starts to fail because of androgen deprivation. Here she is, a power lifter, right? What happens is that it's like using an old elastic band. So the joints, because they're not getting stimulated by, the cells are getting stimulated by testosterone,
lubricated,
so what happens, like using an old elastic band. So what happened is exactly what we were concerned about. She would blow out her elbow and have a catastrophic injury to her left elbow in Brisbane, and almost, we thought she was out of sport altogether at that point. Never think she'd actually recover from it.
Right.
So that is the truth behind that. It's not about Laurel Hubbard having been a transitioned individual, as what the media and the world tried to portray, that she's participating as an unfairness to women's participation in sport. Her unannounced to the rest of the world is that all these other metabolic functions were going on inside her body, and there's only a few people in the world that actually knew it was happening, and to which even the organizers were made aware of it 2 weeks ahead of time. But they were more concerned, the leaders of the Commonwealth were more concerned about getting out ahead of the IOC, and kind of in their multi-sport events to say, we have the first transgendered athlete competing at our games, and we're more inclusive than you are. So they use the opportunity to politicize their games competition with the IOC and their political use of inclusionary practices against the wherewithal of her safety on the field of play. And that's concerning because the IOC, again, it comes back to doing the science and the research to ensure the safety of the individuals, to which the leadership of the Commonwealth should have known as well. And so they were alerted to the fact by outsiders, but not by the IOC. And that has always been kind of the nugget, the problem, because the IOC never did the science and the research in the first place.
For me, answering that question, why should people care about this, is really like what you said, is do no harm, transgender community is such a small percentage. Yeah. And if they don't have allies, they're, they're not going to have a voice. They're not going to be heard. I think that that's one thing that the Paralympics has done very well, and the similarities are striking. As far as the parallels, making those connections, Paralympian, and transgender, because to transition. Just in that process, I mean, you've gone through many interviews, study, that so much goes into that. You're not just going to decide, oh, I think I'm going to be, I think I'm going to transition. It doesn't work that way. That's such a silly notion,
right?
That somebody would transition to, to excel in a sport. That's just crazy to me. And also the other thing, the other thing that you brought up is, each individual is an individual. We need to look at, each individual. We produce and absorb, metabolize different hormones, chemicals differently. And, and then also, there's, when you're talking about sexuality, when you're talking about gender, you're talking, there's a whole spectrum, and where you fit on that spectrum. And the thing that strikes me too is when you're talking about an elite athlete, they are not normal. They're not normal. I mean, that's what makes them exceptional.
Right.
Michael Phelps, should he be, because he's as tall as he is and his hand width and, foot size,
right.
It's like, should that be illegal? It's just, but that's the nature of elite sports.
Right.
So, it's just like, why it just seems so much of the conversation is so transphobic, that I'm hearing and seeing, and people saying things, that are hurtful, but also very inaccurate. It's hard to accept and embrace that, what, the IOC didn't do their homework. They didn't, this isn't, what they put down, like you said, I mean, it did tremendous harm.
Yeah.
But we live in such a litigious society that, oh my God, if they came forward with this information, then there would be no more IOC.
Right.
I mean, they would be, they would be sued, and then there would be no IOC, International Olympic Committee. I mean, it's just like, it's crazy. It really is crazy.
And this is what this is about. And I think if I can just back up, because I would love to answer that in more fuller context. But initially, I just want to make sure when somebody steps into transition, it's done for the purpose of mental health and what we call gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria is caused by low receptor uptake of androgens. So that's why gender dysphoria happens. So it's about dealing with the gender. So what happens is the body goes through gestation. I just want to be able to say this really quickly before I answer the other part. Is when you go through gestation and you're 10 months within gestation period of 10 months. Sorry. 8 to 10 weeks of gestation during your mother's pregnancy, is what happens is during conception. Thank you. What happens is there's a single gonad. There's not two gonads, so that could be two ovaries or two testicles. But there's a single gonad that we start off all. But we all start off the same. We all start off physiologically as female in fetal development. And what happens is when the Y chromosome kicks off, it increases, it sends messaging to the SRY gene, increases testosterone from that one gonad, that then sends more testosterone to increase inside the physiology of the fetus to inevitably create the male sex characteristics. Okay, so what happens is that because of low receptor uptake. So imagine, the best way I can explain it, imagine a dry sponge, like one you would use in your kitchen, and all of a sudden you add water to it. So imagine the water being the testosterone that's being secreted from the gonads. So it becomes soft and pliable, and then it starts to release water on the other side, right? When it becomes saturated. So what happens is that you get this flushing of testosterone through that receptor, and what happens is very little of it is released on the other side. So it doesn't reach the hypothalamus gland, or a very limited amount reaches the hypothalamus glands for the simplicity of our conversation, to masculinize the hypothalamus gland. So because the hypothalamus gland is where the central the gender ID to which our brains identify on gender. So what happens is when the limits of testosterone don't connect to the hypothalamus gland, what happens is the body goes one way and the brain keeps going in the same trajectory to which it started. So there is a physical break between gender and sex. It's a very physical science. It's not something that somebody makes up. The dysphoria is caused by when you and I are born, mom and dad look at the sex of our bodies and they go male or female, and then they put us on one track or the other, and then we're socialized that way. But what happens is that as we are growing up and we're being socialized in that trajectory, the brain is competing against that.
The brain is doing
and saying, "I'm not Bob, I'm Bobby." And so the dysphoria is that influx that's going on between, and that's why, and that's why there's variations of gender dysphoria. I have a very low receptor uptake, so I had a very progressive version of it. People have varying degrees of it, depending on how much testosterone during gestation masculinized the hypothalamus gland. So it's a very physical science. It's a very known science and established science. So anybody that says it's made up and all those other things, that is untrue.
Right. And I mean, it just goes back to, I was born this way, right?
Right.
Born this way.
Right.
It's like, we are gender and gender identity, sexual identity. You are born that way. That's what makes sense in our own minds, right?
And Greg, it's really interesting. I don't know in the corporate world, I always see people ask me about pronouns, and it's really, I'll never forget a time I was asked to do a commercial for the Canadian Olympic Committee just before COVID, during Pride Week here in Toronto, and I did a commercial with them. And I remember, I'll never forget. I was late coming into the boardroom at the Canadian Olympic Committee here in Toronto, and this big long boardroom, and there's all these Olympians around this table. There must have been about 18 to 20 people, and I was the last one to sit down. And I went around this room, and the person started to my left, and everybody gave their pronouns all the way around this table. Then it came to me, like, there's like, right? And I just said, "Hi, I'm Kristen. Be you." Right? It just kind of shocked everybody around the table, because I was watching all these Olympians around this Canadian Olympians around this table, giving all their pronouns, and it came around to me. I just going, "This is surreal." And I just went, and it came to me. I said, "Hi, I'm Kristen." I said, "Be you," and everybody's kind of laughed, because really it is
be you,
be you, right?
Just be you, exactly.
Yeah, and I think
be who you are,
exactly. And I think we've got my whole experience in this side of it is, I always see my experience and my diversity is unique to Kristen. I've never been able to speak on behalf of somebody else's experience, and never would I ever. And because we all have different lived experiences, and as you and I, if I can say, my adoption interacts with that. My lived experience, having coming from New Zealand experience, is engaged in that in that supplementation of my lived experience and where I am today with my diversity. It is unique to me. And so everybody has that unique experience. And I think this is what I've been able to do with the IOC and with sport, is being able to focus on what are the values of the Olympic movement? Why do we do sport? Let's forget about the Olympic Games. Let's forget about the eliteness system. What is it that we all sit here in the room? This is what I did in Lausanne with the leadership of the IC. I said, what is it that what we all believe in? Why are we here today? Because we believe in the values of sport. We believe in the values of health and well-being. We also believe in the connection of community. And that is why we are all here, and kind of in what we understand the Olympic movement, the Olympic Charter to embrace. And I think everybody had their aha moment, and to realize it's about long-term participation actively in sport, no matter your diversity, and it's ensuring that you're actively participating in community, and that it is up to the IOC, and this is where I really focused on with them and other work that I do in my architectural world, is to focus on the commitment and moving from the ideas of leadership to stewardship. And that leadership is about short-term goals, and stewardship is about long-term goals and planning. And it's like looking to the IOC and other, if we're talking about sport, looking to FIFA and other big global brands to be those leaders, to figure out how to get beyond every 4 years and a major games event, and being 365 days a year.
Yeah. And, you know, like what we had kind of touched on before, as, you know, is community, you know, health and wellness and inclusion. Well, Kristen, how can we stay in touch with you? How can we, you know, stay focused on what your adventures are?
Well, I've been very involved in the last couple of years with the IOC, and I've been in a reconciliation period with them, and I'm kind of at the ends of all of that. I'm trying to move away from my elite sport world and taking kind of the lessons I've taken from all of this to focus in my world of architecture and helping to build communities and design communities internationally, nationally and internationally, to help industries to pivot, to ensure that we engage in diversity in a way that is part of our day-to-day life and part of that foundation. And so the best way to engage with me, I guess, would be through all my social media. And that's would be at this point where I can make those connections. And I'd be happy for anybody to reach out to me and where I can be helpful to them.
And where are you on social? Where are you on social?
I'm on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn, and all the main social links.
Is it at Kristen Worley?
At Kristen Worley. Yeah, you can find me at any one of those.
At Kristen. Okay,
it's my name.
Yeah,
you can find me in those.
Yeah, and Kristen's book is Woman Enough, which I highly recommend. It really was eye-opening. So thank you for joining me on this episode of Greg Louganis is Alive. And if you liked this episode, please share this with someone you love. And don't forget to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Until next time, namaste.
Yay Networks.